Behind the barbed wires and watchtowers, during the Second World War, a group of women suffered in silence, forced into a life of unimaginable horror. They were the female slaves, coerced into prostitution, their bodies exploited for the twisted desires of their captors. These women in binds had to cope with the unimaginable trauma inflicted upon them.
One of our officers who did extraordinary things was Virginia Hall, the most highly decorated female civilian of World War II.
One can only imagine the long-term effects on their mental and physical health. Join us as we scan inside the Nazi brothels, revealing what the lives of the female slaves were like. The establishment of the military brothels. Sex and death are two impulses directly linked to war, although they seem like completely separate things. Territorial conquests end up being symbolic conquests, unfortunately, in many cases involving sexual violence against women. For Nazism, this was a planned state policy carried out throughout Europe, resulting in the violation of more than 34,000 women. Militarized brothels with slaves from numerous countries, spy prostitutes in Berlin, and exclusive brothels for prisoners in concentration camps were just some of the methods employed by the Third Reich to control the sexual lives of its soldiers and prisoners. What drove the Nazi regime to establish these brothels? And how did they justify such heinous exploitation? Keep watching to find out the details. As Nazism spread across Europe, its leaders saw the need to establish military brothels alongside military bases. These brothels were managed by the Reich and served as places where German soldiers could engage in forced sexual relations with enslaved women. This grim state policy had two main goals. Firstly, it aimed to promote the sexual norms of Nazism, discouraging soldiers from engaging in activities like excessive masturbation or homosexuality. Secondly, it sought to control the women with whom the soldiers interacted, reducing the risk of sexually transmitted diseases that could decrease combat readiness. The operating hours of these brothels, where German soldiers could engage in, was typically in the night, where they carried out public display of systematic rape. It's crucial to emphasize that the German troops loved every bit of these acts of violence done to the victims in the camp. It's sad to note that the women in these military brothels did not choose to be there. The vast majority were victims of mass abductions or kidnappings. In small villages, officers would arrive, select the most attractive girls, often based on Aryan beauty standards, and then take them as prisoners. Life in Nazi brothels, a true hell on earth. In the daily lives of young Nazis, engaging in sexual relations with Slavic women was strictly prohibited due to their classification as an inferior caste. However, within the confines of military brothels, such relationships were permitted. The only exceptions to this rule were Jewish and Romani women, who were excluded and sent to concentration camps, where they faced horrifying fates that we will delve into later. These atrocities were not hidden from the public eye. Throughout the conflict, numerous European states that had been invaded by the Nazis formally complained about the mass abductions of women. For instance, the Polish government in exile lodged a complaint on May 3, 1941, detailing how the SS conducted raids to seize young Polish women and transport them to their grim, militarized brothels. What's astonishing is that, on paper, Nazism condemned prostitution as a social disease that corrupted the minds of the youth. However, it seems that this moral stance was conveniently cast aside in times of war. Even high-ranking officers of the Third Reich did not refrain from participating in this reprehensible practice. Life in Nazi brothels was a true hell on earth, with subhuman health conditions in the old destroyed buildings. Several girls lived sleeping and receiving their clients in the same bed. There were no changes of clothes or nutritious meals, only the basic conditions to make the slaves attractive enough for German troops. A common problem was sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea. If a girl was diagnosed with these conditions, she was treated in a very rudimentary and disinterested manner. There would always be a prisoner to replace her. If the young woman did not improve soon, her fate was the firing squad and an unmarked grave. As we mentioned earlier, the military management of brothels also sought to appease the epidemics of these diseases, which could incapacitate a soldier for a long time. It was precisely for this reason that British spy Virginia Hall organized a series of clandestine brothels where women intentionally infected soldiers. This made her earn the title of the most dangerous of all Allied spies, the most feared lady during the Second World War. Virginia Hall was a spy who was considered to be one of the most dangerous Allied spies of the Second World War. She organized a network of thousands in the French resistance, managed to escape being hunted by the Gestapo many times, and was responsible for acts of sabotage against the Axis, jailbreaks, and critical intelligence gathering in wartime France. The exploits of the daring and audacious spy Virginia Hall were almost lost to history, but her story deserves to be remembered. Virginia Hall was born to a rich Maryland family in Baltimore in 1906. She was raised and educated in order to marry into the wealthy social circle of her peers, but Virginia was different. She wanted adventure and loved to hunt, as she called herself capricious and cantankerous. In her childhood, Virginia was class president, editor-in-chief of the newspaper, and captain of the field hockey team. In a nod to her future career path, Virginia tried to enter the Foreign Service at a time when only 6 U.S. diplomats were women. She was denied entry, but found work in the same field as a clerk in the consular office in Poland in 1931. Virginia later worked in many consular offices throughout Europe. She had been an active person as a child and young adult, but in 1932, while bird hunting, she accidentally discharged her shotgun into her left leg. Her leg had to be amputated below her knee because of gangrene, and she used a wooden prosthetic for the rest of her life. She nicknamed the prosthetic Cuthbert. It weighed 7 pounds and was attached by leather belts wrapped around her waist. As Virginia harbored aspirations of a diplomatic career, she persevered by reapplying to the Foreign Service, only to face rejection due to her leg. Hindered by gender biases, she found herself unable to progress further in the consular service, prompting her resignation in 1939, a tumultuous time as Europe hovered on the brink of the Second World War. Fate intervened when Virginia found herself in Paris as war erupted. Displaying her innate sense of duty, she volunteered to drive an ambulance and remained in France as it succumbed to Nazi occupation in the summer of 1940. With France divided, she witnessed the establishment of Vichy France in the south, while the northern and western regions fell under German control. Her path towards espionage was unexpectedly set in motion during a chance encounter on a train departing France. Meeting a fellow passenger who turned out to be a British operative, Virginia received crucial contact information that would alter the course of her life. Later, at a social gathering where she voiced her concerns about Hitler and the Nazi regime, she caught the attention of a woman who would ultimately lead her into the world of espionage. This pivotal figure was none other than Vera Atkins, a British spy master who had immigrated to Britain in 1937. Atkins recognized Virginia's potential and offered her the opportunity to join the clandestine efforts against the Axis powers, marking the beginning of Virginia's deadly game that made her become fearsome amongst all female spies in history. Virginia kept on frustrating the Nazis. In the summer of 1940, amidst the turmoil of the Second World War, the British government established the Special Operations Executive, SOE, with a clear mission: to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe while supporting local resistance movements. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's directive to the SOE was unequivocal. His plan was to set Europe ablaze. During this pivotal period, Vera Atkins took charge of overseeing the operations of Virginia Hall and 36 other female agents. At that period, Virginia proved to be excellent amongst other female agents there. Her remarkable capabilities stemmed from her extensive education and linguistic prowess, fluently speaking French, Italian, and German, a valuable asset for the SOE. Atkins was particularly impressed by Virginia's intimate knowledge of the French countryside. With Atkins's guidance, Virginia underwent rigorous training before being deployed to France in 1941, emerging as one of the SOE's earliest agents in the region. Initially tasked with providing intelligence on Vichy France, including political developments and economic conditions, Virginia quickly excelled beyond her initial mandate. Instead of merely gathering information, Virginia proved to be adept at building and managing a spy network. Codenamed Heckler, this network served as a vital logistical hub, recruiting agents and coordinating their sabotage activities across occupied territories. Virginia's role expanded to encompass not only intelligence gathering but also orchestrating resistance efforts in key areas like Toulouse and Lyon. A significant factor contributing to Virginia's success was the underestimation of women by the Nazis early in the war. Their chauvinistic beliefs led them to discount the effectiveness of female spies, providing Virginia with an advantage that she skillfully exploited to further Allied interests. In Lyon, Virginia started her networking activities by standing at a convent. She befriended a brothel owner and received information from prostitutes who were friendly with the occupying German troops. She set up safe houses for those working in her network and developed a specialty in jailbreaks. Helped by prison guards who accepted bribes, Virginia assisted SOE operative Peter Churchill in several of his missions in France during 1942. He delivered cash, ration books, and identity documents for forgers in an effort to get resistance members released. Following his narrow escape from the Gestapo, Churchill took charge of a network of spies operating in France during the war. In an era where advanced technology was scarce, agents relied heavily on their creativity and resourcefulness to deliver vital information to their handlers. For instance, the BBC ingeniously embedded coded messages into its nightly broadcasts, while Virginia Hall, operating under the guise of a New York Post reporter, cleverly incorporated coded messages into her news stories, which were then relayed to London by her editor. Despite her covert efforts, Virginia's activities did not escape the notice of the Nazis, who quickly realized the significant threat she posed as a female spy. Her impressive track record speaks volumes, orchestrating daring rescues of agents from Nazi prisons, orchestrating acts of sabotage targeting vital railroads and factories, and even causing the disappearance of Nazi pilots who had parachuted out of danger. In essence, she embodied Churchill's directive to ignite Europe with resistance. As her notoriety grew, the Gestapo intensified their efforts to apprehend her, launching a relentless pursuit that led them to Lyon. Virginia's ability to constantly alter her appearance kept the Nazis on their toes, rendering them uncertain of her next move. Her remarkable exploits included numerous jailbreaks, acts of sabotage, and intelligence gathering on enemy troop movements, earning her a place at the top of the Nazis' most wanted list. Among her pursuers was Klaus Barbie, infamously known as the Butcher of Lyon, who spared no effort in his quest to capture her. Under his orders, wanted posters featuring Virginia's likeness circulated, labeling her as the enemy's most dangerous spy. Despite the constant threat of capture, Virginia kept on frustrating the Nazis. Virginia Hall eliminated a lot of Nazi soldiers. After Virginia Hall was declared wanted by the Nazis, a sharp-featured woman with shoulder-length hair and wide-set eyes were the details obtained from French double agents concerning her. The Nazis incorrectly believed Virginia was Canadian, and Barbie once said that he'd give anything to lay his hands on that limping Canadian. He was convinced that capturing her would further his career. In November 1942, Nazis suddenly seized all of France. The Vichy regime remained in power, but collaborated with the Nazis. Virginia knew she needed to get out if she was going to survive. She had previously helped Peter Churchill escape to Spain by accompanying him on a train because couples aroused less suspicion. For her own escape, she fled from Lyon to Perpignan. Then she walked over a 7,500-foot pass in the Pyrenees to Spain. Virginia covered 50 miles in 2 days with a wooden leg, sometimes walking through snow. She messaged her handlers that she was okay, but Cuthbert was giving her trouble. Not understanding that she was referring to her prosthetic, they told her that if Cuthbert was giving her any difficulty, she should have him eliminated. Craig Gralley reported he found the path Virginia used during her wartime escape. At the time, the French called it the Freedom Trail, linking France to Spain that many refugees used. It is now unmarked, its importance lost to time. Repeating Virginia's journey, Gralley said it would have been a difficult trek for an experienced hiker. An exceptional feat for Virginia, a woman with a prosthetic leg. Following her daring journey, Virginia Hall was apprehended by Spanish authorities for illegally entering the country and subsequently spent 6 weeks behind bars. However, her release came about through the remarkable act of fellow inmates smuggling a letter from her to the U.S. consulate in Barcelona. After regaining her freedom, she continued her work for the Special Operations Executive, SOE, in Spain, before making her way back to London in 1943. The following year, Virginia embarked on a new chapter by joining the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, established by the U.S. government in 1942, with the mission of gathering intelligence and executing special operations. Eager to resume her activities in France in 1944, Virginia found herself welcomed back with open arms. Her journey back into occupied territory was nothing short of extraordinary. She arrived in Brittany aboard a British torpedo boat and managed to evade detection by the Gestapo by disguising herself as an elderly peasant woman. Virginia went to great lengths to further alter her appearance, seeking the expertise of a makeup artist to learn how to convincingly simulate wrinkles on her face, and even having her teeth altered by a dentist to adopt the appearance of a poorer individual rather than the affluent American she truly was. Additionally, she dyed her hair gray to complete her transformation. Once back in France, Virginia immediately immersed herself in aiding the French resistance, locating crucial resources such as maps, drop zones, and safe houses. She also played a pivotal role in supporting the Jedburgh Team, a collaborative effort between Allied forces aimed at deploying agents into occupied Europe to carry out acts of sabotage following the Normandy invasion. Virginia's contributions extended beyond intelligence gathering. She provided training to resistance fighters in guerrilla warfare tactics and diligently reported her findings until the arrival of Allied troops, who subsequently took over her network. Prior to the Normandy invasion, she orchestrated airdrops and coordinated resistance efforts to destroy bridges and disrupt enemy supply lines. In one particularly notable achievement, Virginia's team was credited with derailing freight trains, destroying 4 bridges, eliminating 150 Nazi soldiers, and capturing an additional 500 enemy combatants. Their actions significantly contributed to reclaiming villages in advance of the Allied forces' arrival in occupied France. The main epicenters of European prostitution. As earlier stated, sex and prostitution are fundamental aspects of war. For the German soldiers who occupied France, the summer of 1940 felt like a long vacation, in which they had the opportunity to occupy the enemy's most prized city, but also to flirt and harass French women. France was one of the main epicenters of European prostitution. Many authors ironically describe the period between 1940 and 1945 as a golden age for the profession in the country. Prostitutes expanded their businesses like never before, and more than 10,000 women had to become prostitutes to survive the horrors of war. The vast majority of their clients were the very Nazis who had humiliated their army and people. However, as paid sex increased, so did the hatred and resentment of the rest of the French towards those who offered their services to the enemy. The tragic part is that for many women who were victims of German barrels in Europe, the hell did not end in 1945 with the unconditional defeat of the Third Reich. Once the conflict was over, prostitutes were persecuted as traitors to the homeland and collaborators with the Nazi regime. In France, prostitutes were publicly lynched, stripped, shaved, and had a swastika painted on their faces. Like Caesar's mark, they were forced to march with the sign that they had slept with SS officers. Others were shaved, and they went down in history as shaved women. In these cases, they were victims of violence during and after the Second World War. The sexual exploitation of women in brothels. Within the harrowing confines of concentration camps, which existed as isolated realms of horror with their own twisted rules, several external institutions operated, and brothels were no exception. While one might assume that these spaces were solely reserved for guards and overseeing officers, there were also women designated to serve the most influential prisoners, including those who collaborated with Nazism or managed the labor force of their fellow inmates. It's crucial to understand that these women were coerced and threatened into their roles. There was no voluntary participation. Just as earlier stated, the inception of concentration camp brothels dates back to 1942, when one was established in the Mauthausen camp. Subsequently, in June 1943, a brothel was set up in Auschwitz, followed by another in Ravensbrück the following month. This policy drew inspiration from Soviet gulags, where the amount of work performed determined prisoners' food rations. Those who demonstrated productivity and collaborated with SS officers were granted permission to visit these establishments. This service was primarily utilized by capos, prisoners with a certain status within the camp, who endured relatively less harsh conditions and had greater access to resources such as food and hygiene. However, the majority of prisoners lacked the necessary energy and privilege to patronize these brothels. Sexual encounters in these brothels were entirely supervised and planned. According to researchers, only the missionary position was allowed, and the act was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes, not a minute more. The horror generally occurred at night between 8 and 10 p.m., although on Sundays the shift was much longer, making it the most grueling and painful day for the prisoners. They had to endure eternal hours receiving violators in their court. ERS, the existence of lager bordel, gave rise to a new form of trade within concentration camps. The business was monopolized by common criminals, those who before being imprisoned were already breaking the law. A system of green triangles was used, which could be exchanged for 15 minutes. There is also evidence that in some cases, imprisoned women had a tattoo on their with the inscription, "Camp Whore," a humiliating way to identify and separate them from the rest of the prison population. As we already mentioned, women in internment brothels were forced to perform this work and came from various concentration camps distributed across Europe. For example, one of the most frequent was the entirely female Ravensbrück camp, where the most attractive young women were selected, preferably without Jewish ancestry. The SS officers devised a perverse method that aligned the prostitutes, providing them with minimal benefits such as slightly higher rations or the possibility of personal hygiene. This generated envy and resentment among the rest of the female population in the camps, thus breaking any possibility of collaboration between the imprisoned women. Nina Mikova, a concentration camp prisoner, later admitted that when it was found that one of the girls from her block had been chosen, they captured her, threw a blanket over her, and beat her until she couldn't move. She went further to say that she didn't know if they would recover. They just sought better treatment and then punished them in this way. It is estimated that in total about 200 women worked in these brothels with the promise of being released after 6 months, something that never happened. Nazi regime's extreme violence. Beyond the horrendous crime of mass rape, the Third Reich also initiated a disturbing campaign of sexual re-education within concentration camps. Alongside using brothels to control inmates, foster collaboration, and quell disturbances, Heinrich Himmler sought to utilize them as a tool for showing prisoners of the pink triangle, that of homosexuals, the supposed pleasures of heterosexual relations. This amounted to a form of conversion therapy, an attempt to cure homosexuality, which the Third Reich viewed as a moral degeneration emblematic of modernity. Historians assert that Himmler mandated compulsory weekly visits to the camp brothel for all gay prisoners as part of this so-called treatment. It was an appalling attempt to eradicate same-sex attraction through forced engagement in heterosexual acts. After the war ended, the few women who survived this torment faced the additional burden of being labeled as camp prostitutes, despite being victims of the Nazi regime's violence. The majority of women who worked in internment camp brothels were of German descent, but were categorized by the Nazis as social outcasts, who were homeless, alcoholics, itinerant musicians, prostitutes, or simply women who did not conform to the ultra-conservative Nazi ideology. They were often individuals from impoverished backgrounds, exploited and victimized by the regime for its twisted purposes. Prostitution within concentration camps was a dark secret, at least until the early 1970s when several memoirs were published delving into this aspect with some depth. However, the topic remained taboo in research on Nazism until the mid-1990s, when new publications by female researchers broke the silence. One of the strangest and unique cases of using prostitution as a war policy was Salon Kitty. It was a select Berlin brothel operated by Nazism where, in addition to offering sex and pleasures, espionage campaigns were conducted against important figures. The place operated at number 11 Giesenstrasse, where a building with commercial premises houses a headphone store and an interior decoration store today. However, between 1930 and 1942, the largest brothel of the Third Reich operated there. The important name in this operation was Katharina Emma Sophie Schmidt, alias Kitty Schmidt, a woman who operated as the leader of the 500-square-meter brothel on the third floor of the building. Prostitutes from all over Europe, mainly from countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia, worked there. Kitty was a music teacher in her 40s who had lived in various parts of the world and had learned the secrets of the night, finding in the brothel a secure and perpetually in-demand business. On paper, the Nazis were against these types of establishments that proliferated throughout Berlin during the 1920s. Keep in mind that before Nazism, it is estimated that 12,000 women and 30,000 men were engaged in sexual services. The difference is that Salon Kitty was intended to be a meeting place for foreign diplomats settled in Berlin or passing through the capital, although the place was also frequented by military personnel and potential internal enemies of Adolf Hitler's regime. The brothel rooms were the ideal place to learn the secrets of the city's most important men. In the intimate lobby of the salon, where a grand piano rested, crystal chandeliers and thick carpets, it was expected that confidences would be made that could be used by Nazi leaders to punish dissidents or anticipate decisions of friendly countries. For this, a listening device with a microphone was installed. What was said in the rooms on the third floor reached the basement, where a network of cables transported the sound to record it on larger discs. The masterminds behind the plan were two high-ranking young men from the Nazi regime. On the one hand, Reinhard Heydrich, the ultimate head of security and later co-architect of the Holocaust, who had the idea. On the other hand, another mastermind behind the plan was one of the main exponents of German espionage, Walter Schellenberg, who put it into practice. Contemplations concerning the role of Madame Miss Kitty with Nazism. Salon Kitty, a high-class brothel established by the National Socialists during the Second World War, has long been shrouded in mystery and subject to endless debates. From the methods of espionage employed within its walls to the frequency of visits by prominent individuals, many aspects of Salon Kitty remain obscured by the passage of time. Among the countless tales surrounding this infamous establishment, one frequently recounted anecdote involves Galeazzo Ciano, the son-in-law of Benito Mussolini, allegedly slipping away from a nearby cinema during screenings to partake in the services offered by Schmidt's girls at Salon Kitty. Ciano would then seamlessly rejoin the audience just before the movie's conclusion, blending back into the crowd without a trace. Adding to the intrigue is the enigmatic figure of Madame Miss Kitty. While some suggest she was merely a willing collaborator with Nazi sympathies, rumors suggest that she may have been coerced into collaboration due to her expertise in the field. Complicating matters further is the existence of the exploitation film Salon Kitty by Italian director Tinto Brass, which sensationalizes events and delves into the realm of perverse fantasy. Such cinematic portrayals have only served to blur the already ambiguous lines between fact and fiction surrounding Salon Kitty. However, like in Tinto Brass's film, the percentage of truth was widely diluted in exaggerated and morbid fictions. The paradox is that the stories told by real survivors of prostitution during this time recount much more gruesome and savage events than those in any horror movie. That's because prostitution was both forced and voluntary in the 20th century. Despite the passage of time, the allure of Nazi spy prostitutes has endured, leading to a resurgence of interest in the subject during the 1970s with a wave of films set in Reich bordellos. These cinematic interpretations further muddy the waters of historical accuracy, intertwining reality with artistic license. As a result, uncovering the true story of Salon Kitty remains a daunting task, with speculation and conjecture clouding the search for concrete answers. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.